Bob Devaney would bring the Cornhuskers into the modern era of college football in a major way. In his 11 seasons, he brought home 8 conference titles and 2 national championships, establishing a tradition of winning along the way. He had raised the already high expectations of Husker fans. Devaney had pulled Nebraska from the depths of college football purgatory, and many fans were worried that Nebraska would once again slide into the pit as he left in 1972. He put many minds at ease by handpicking a successor, a quiet and little-known assistant coach, Tom Osborne. Hi, I'm Aaron Muller, and welcome to Cobsmacked. This is a channel dedicated to Husker football, the news, the stories, and the history. If you're a fan of Nebraska, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. Getting into this week's topic, we're going to do part 3 of the Husker History Dive that we've been doing, where we've been looking at the history of Husker coaches throughout the years. And if you haven't watched the part 1 and part 2, we're up to 1972 at this point. So if you haven't watched those, I'll try to link those up in the corner. You can go back and watch those before you continue with this one. Getting into this week, though, we are covering Tom Osborne starting in 1973. It would be argued that Bob Devaney might not have a national title without Tom Osborne, but without Bob Devaney, we also don't have Tom Osborne at all. So Osborne had said in previous interviews that he might not have considered coaching at all had Devaney not approached him and convinced him to become an unpaid graduate assistant on the staff. That might not fly so well now because everybody's kind of looking for money right out as a coach, but he was willing to learn something from Devaney, and Devaney was willing to teach him all the things he could. And as we had mentioned in previous Husker History episodes, go check that out again if you have not, Devaney would elevate Tom Osborne to offensive coordinator in 1969. So after just a few short years of having no college football experience as a coach, he goes on to elevate him to offensive coordinator. And so that just kind of speaks to the amount that he was willing to learn and the amount that he was willing to provide to the team. And Devaney had so much faith in him that he basically just handed the reins over completely of the offense to him, as well as allowing him to utilize his doctorate in educational psychology and to focus on 3 areas that Tom Osborne really thought were important in success for the team. Those were strong academic programs for student athletes first and foremost, strength and conditioning programs, and establishing a more well-respected walk-on program at Nebraska. T.O. would help Devaney capture 2 national championships during his time, and he would continue with these programs as he assumed that head coaching role in 1973. Although he was handpicked, many were surprised by Devaney's selection here. Whereas Devaney was charismatic and outspoken, very people-friendly, which Tom Osborne could be seen that way as well. But the 35-year-old Osborne at the time was more quiet and reserved, kind of conservative, and they were just almost like polar opposites there. Some of the other assistants were almost like resentful that they had gotten passed over for a guy that was fairly new to coaching in general. And, again, he wasn't loud, he wasn't vocal, he was just him. And the expectations were high after the Devaney era, so this hand-picked status did allow Tom Osborne some leeway that he might not have otherwise had. And Osborne would later say that he was fortunate to have Devaney as his athletic director until 1993. So it helps that he was handpicked, and then also helps that your boss is the guy that handpicked you. So, still, his first season was full of issues. We'll get right into it. So, in 1973, as I mentioned, some of the assistant coaches were almost bitter that they didn't get the job and Tom Osborne did. So this caused a little bit of tension in the staff for that first season. It seemed to work itself out pretty quickly. Once people worked with him and worked under him and realized just what this guy is about, then I think that kind of eased things. And I think that people started to see, the coaching staff, I think they started to see exactly what Devaney had seen in Tom Osborne. Nebraska did suffer its first shutout in 50-plus games his first season, losing to Oklahoma and missing out on an Orange Bowl bid. And this was just a few of the things that kind of went wrong. The transition did not go as smoothly as people thought. He did win, 9 games that season, but they did go through a little bit of trouble with the players themselves as well. So he dismissed a team captain right before the Cotton Bowl, and Tom was kind of going against what Devaney had established as pre-bowl practices by still making the guys work hard up to that point. Devaney, once you reached a bowl game, Devaney was kind of relaxed. You kind of made it relaxed before this big moment. And Tom Osborne was complete opposite. He liked to run guys. They would say that all the time. They're like, he liked us to run stairs. He liked us to run sprints and, all these kinds of things. And so these guys were still working hard because the work wasn't done yet. You still had a bowl game to perform for. And the players didn't like it. And so one of the captains organized a player-only meeting without Osborne knowing about it, and apparently tried to boycott the game. In later interviews, that captain would say it was a big misunderstanding and that he was just trying to address everybody's concerns, because he said a lot of guys were coming to me with concerns. I made a player meeting where they could voice them all at one time, and nobody spoke, so we just kind of disassembled. Well, some of the players went to Tom Osborne and said that they're trying to boycott the bowl game now. So the Cotton Bowl did come, and Tom Osborne did let the guy play, but he was stripped of that captain's title. And the other players around him said that, you know, he kind of knew he messed up at that point, and that he was still a team player. He came in and he played like a captain regardless of if he had that title or not. But this was kind of the point, even just in this first season, that Tom was known as, although he is the nice guy, his law is, like, his word is law. So you don't want to go against him, and you respect him and he will respect you right back. Like I mentioned, Osborne didn't really have a bad season his first season. He never won fewer than 9 games, but he did struggle to beat the Sooners that first 5 seasons straight. So 8 out of the 9 meetups in Osborne's, early days, 8 of the 9 meetings they lost to the Sooners. And by this time, the rivalry had already grown to legendary proportions back when Devaney was there. The Sooners have always kind of been like, we are Midwest, we are right next to each other. We're just big powerhouses of the Midwest. And so the rivalry itself had grown to national perspectives. Like, people wanted to tune into this game because we were juggernauts and we were always like butting heads. But it was lopsided these first few years under Osborne. And so Oklahoma believed in a thing called Sooner Magic. You watched the interviews with the coaches and the players. They said that we didn't know how we were going to do it. We just knew that we were going to win because somehow we were going to pull one out. And Nebraska fans started to believe that too. Like, even if they were ahead in a game, they were like, oh, at what point is this going to flip? And in my mind, it almost feels a lot like how the Iowa games have gone as of late. Like, a lot of people want to consider Iowa a rivalry for us, but we haven't been winning those games. And so it just feels that way. It feels like even though next year, if we go to Iowa and, we're up by 10 points, people are always going to have it in the back of their brain. Look at this past season. We were up by how much, like 15 points, and we blew a fourth quarter lead. So it's something like that there always is a sense that this team that's you should be beating or that you should be competing with, you're not doing it, and they're always going to pull it out over you. Barry Switzer was the head coach of the Sooners, and he was very Devaney-like in his personality. Switzer's charismatic personality helped him to land better recruits, specifically in Texas. And many Nebraska fans thought that maybe, this difference between Tom Osborne being the nice guy, the calm guy, the quiet guy, and Barry Switzer being very charismatic, that maybe this was the difference, and that maybe Tom was too nice to get the good guys to come to Nebraska. In 1978, both Oklahoma and Nebraska were ranked going into their game. Oklahoma was ranked number 1 and Nebraska was number 4 in the country, and they were both 9-0 going into the game. Oklahoma was rolling on its way to another national title. They had been decimating everybody they had played up to this point, and Barry Switzer would say that this was the best team he ever had. And there was just, nobody thought Nebraska had a chance in this game. But Nebraska would go on to force 9 fumbles in this game, recovering 6 of them. And we still kept it close. I mean, even with 6 turnovers, you'd think that you'd kind of have a pretty established lead. We still only won 17-14, and that was with the Sooners having a drive right at the end where they got up to the 2-yard line with 2 minutes left, and so they looked like they were going to punch in another touchdown, and that was when the final fumble happened, and we recovered it to end the game. Nebraska would beat Oklahoma for the first time under Tom Osborne, and it would be the first time we beat them since that game of the century in 1971. Barry Switzer says he still remembers this. Like, when people ask you, like, what's the game you remember the most with that Nebraska rivalry? And he said it's not the wins. It's not all the many wins that we had over Nebraska. It's this big loss because it cost him another national championship. So this one really sticks in his side. And he said we knew that we were better than them in that game, and we still lost. And so Nebraska was riding really high. We had finally gotten over the hump of Oklahoma that year, and so it looked like we were on our way to a national title. And then the very next week, Missouri upsets Nebraska, dousing our national title hopes. And in a gut check for Osborne, many players and other coaches would say that once Tom Osborne heard this news, his face turned white, and he just looked like a ghost, because he was informed that in the Orange Bowl that they would play that year, they were going to have a rematch against Oklahoma. So you kind of you get over this big hump of Oklahoma, and then you find out you have to play them again in a bowl game in front of a national crowd. And Oklahoma would get its revenge. They were the better team in the first game, and they really showed it in the second game. They would beat Nebraska 31-24. That's with Nebraska scoring a touchdown as time expired. So it was not as close as that score indicates. Pretty dominant performance by Oklahoma, but again, you get over a hump just to kind of get gut checked right at the end of the season. So the fan pressure from this failure to beat Oklahoma twice in a year led to Tom Osborne actually interviewing at Colorado for a head coaching job. And he was offered the job, and his staff and his wife and his family kind of said, maybe it is time for you to go. Maybe, we'd be okay with like leaving with you. The staff was willing to go with him. And so he almost took it. And I just try to imagine, like, if he did take that, like how much history would change around here. But he said that the loyalty to the players, the loyalty to his home state of Nebraska, and mostly his loyalty to Bob Devaney kept him in Nebraska. So he ended up turning the job down and sticking around. Now, although Osborne was undeniably dedicated to Nebraska at this point, having turned down that Colorado job, he now faced a similar position to what Devaney did in the 60s. Devaney couldn't seem to match Alabama or Bear Bryant. He couldn't match Alabama's speed. He couldn't match their team strength, things like that. So he shifted from a run-heavy offense to a more balanced attack and a more speedy one with Tom Osborne as the offensive coordinator. And in order for Osborne to meet the Oklahoma level and Barry Switzer's level, he too would have to pivot. So ironically, he would have to go back to a run-heavy offense and devoted himself to the option. He used Oklahoma's offense as a blueprint, but he further developed the option schemes in his own way with the I formation, and he recognized the need for a quarterback that could run in order to fit those schemes. So in 1980 began with beating Oklahoma on the recruiting trail for dual threat quarterback Turner Gill. Despite rumors that Nebraska was reluctant to start an African-American quarterback, we had started a couple, I think 2 or 3 before this point. We started some African-American quarterbacks, but people kind of started the rumor mill that he wouldn't be accepted at Nebraska as a true quarterback, but those rumors were just rumors. There was no real base to them, and Osborne sold the good guy like vibe that he carried through his whole career, between the morality, the education, and the personality that he had. He instilled confidence in the fact that he was not going to change who he was, and so players started to recognize, like, this is a good guy. It's not just, he doesn't want me just as a football player. He wants me to be a better human, and that appeased a lot of guys. You wouldn't think that would, being the age that they are. You kind of just want the best program. You want the best team, the team that's going to give you the most, perks. But another big point to bring Turner Gill was that Osborne had also promised him that he could also play baseball at Lincoln as well. So he played a limited role in the 1980. This was really recently that the NCAA had allowed the freshmen to play on varsity teams at universities. So he didn't get to play a lot anyway. But in 1981, Gill would start as the backup. He would actually start third on the depth chart, but Nebraska would start out at 1 and 2, and the offense was really struggling with the other two guys. So he would come in after halftime against Auburn in the fourth game, and they would rally to a 17-3 victory behind him. He locked down the starting job from that point forward. He demolished Colorado the very next week, 59-0, and this kind of set the pace for Turner Gill's career at Nebraska. And his frame, his physicality, the way he ran would kind of be the blueprint for quarterbacks going forward. You look at Tommy Frazier, Scott Frost, Eric Crouch, those kind of guys. They all fit this same blueprint, this schematic of a quarterback, and Turner Gill was the first of that series. So he would go out late in the season with a severe leg bruise. The doctors actually found nerve damage in his leg, and so they kind of pulled him late in the season. And they would eventually lose to Clemson in the Orange Bowl that year, which ended up being a championship game. In 1982, with Gill back and healthy, Nebraska was set to have a very good season. However, they would lose a controversial game midseason to Penn State. Nebraska had the lead 24-21 with Penn State on the 17-yard line with 9 seconds left, and Penn State receiver Mike McCloskey was clearly out of bounds. I will try to throw a clip up here, but the line judge ruled him in. I don't know how he's seen that or what he's seen that we didn't see, but I mean, I was going through to try to figure out, find still shots of it, but I couldn't find any still shots, so I found the video, a video clip for it. But instant replay at the time couldn't be used to overturn calls on the field, so there was really nothing Nebraska could do about it. And the defense was still kind of confused. Like, they thought he was out, but the referee said he was in, so then the game kept going, and the defense was really scrambled at that point. And the very next play, they threw a 4-yard touchdown. So that sealed a Penn State victory, and it was very controversial. There was a lot of like T-shirts and posters that went up that show like a little square cutout of the sideline where the guy caught the ball, and the field must be extended over in that section for Penn State to have caught it inbounds. But this was Nebraska's only loss in 1982, and Penn State would eventually go on to win the national title. Nebraska was hoping if they would win out the rest of the season that eventually they would get a rematch with Penn State in the bowl game, and they never got the opportunity. So another season kind of down the drain. 1983, expectations were at its highest point under Tom Osborne. He returned nearly all of the players from the 82 season. That includes the triplets in the backfield, all seniors now on offense. You had Turner Gill, Mike Rozier, and Irving Fryer. All three of those guys are legendary Huskers, and you had them all at the same time in the same place, and that's kind of incredible in itself. But they would put up incredible offensive performances across the whole season. They averaged 52 points a game with 400 or more rushing yards per game as well. So Gill, a senior, would finish fourth in the Heisman race. He finished the season with 1,500 passing yards, 500 rushing yards, and 15 total touchdowns. He was only eclipsed in success by Mike Rozier, who ended up winning the Heisman that season. And Mike Rozier went 2,100 rushing yards and 29 touchdowns. That's crazy. Like, we would give, an awful lot to get back to that level of a running back. But despite this offensive explosion, the Cornhuskers were haunted by a poor defense. We almost stumbled to Oklahoma once again, but we would eventually fall to Miami in the Orange Bowl, which would end up being national champions. Miami led 17-0 after the first quarter, so they came out to a quick lead. Nebraska wasn't really ready for that, but we would rally back throughout the game, and late in the fourth, we would pull to within one, making the score 30-31. And we would have likely won the title by kicking a field goal to tie the game, but in a cruel twist of irony, Thomas William Osborne would call the infamous call to go for two. And Osborne said it was really no decision at all. He thought that if we wanted to call ourselves champions, we had to win the game. We couldn't just tie it. And nationally, they went on. They tried a 2-point conversion, and it failed. So Miami ended up winning the game and winning the national championship as well. And nationally, media and other fans across the nation would respect Osborne's courage and willingness to risk the championship in order to stick to his moral base and stay true to his values and his character. But Nebraska fans would not have that same silver lining view. They once again saw Osborne get to within reach of a title, and this time it seems like he almost decided to just let it slip away. If you were aware of this time period, and most Husker fans have heard of this infamous going for two moment, but what do you guys think? Would you have gone for two in that scenario, or would you have just cemented yourself a national championship by tying the game? I can see both arguments there, but again, I mentioned his full name, Thomas William Osborne. His initial spell two, I think it's kind of just a funny twist of fate there, but I can understand why he went for two, and I think that I would side with him on that. Like, if you're going to go out as champions, you need to win the game. You can't tie it and say, we're better than that guy. If you didn't beat him, you can't say that. So Tom Osborne would ultimately lose 4 national title matchups between 83 and 93. He would go 2-9 in bowl games in that time, including 7 straight losses between 87 and 93. The years are a little funky because of the bowl games. Like, in the 82 season, you would play in the 83 Orange Bowl. So it's like the year after your actual football season that the bowl games work out. But of those 9 losses, 7 of those came from Florida teams, whether that be Miami or Florida State. And we were outscored 193-108 in that time with Florida teams. We just couldn't compete with their speed. And that was something that Tom Osborne had noted. He said that their team speed was just something like you couldn't outrun them. You couldn't pass past them. You couldn't stop their offense with your defensive players because they were just so fast. And once again, Tom Osborne would go back to the drawing board and tweak his approach, this time pursuing overall team speed, not just that quarterback position. but defense as well. So making the way for some of Nebraska's most legendary players to come in and shine, like Tommy Frazier, Scott Frost, Lawrence Phillips, Amon Green, Corey Schlesinger, who is also from Columbus, Joel Makovica, Clester Johnson. You had defensive players, Jay Foreman, the Peters brothers, Grant Wistrom. I mean, you just had a ton of legendary guys, and maybe they're legendary to me because I was alive during this time, but I mean, these guys are just guys you still hear about, and that's because Tom Osborne tweaked his style a little bit to like recruit these faster guys, whether that be offense or defense. The 90s also kind of took on some traditions that we still hold dearly to this day. The black shirts became a national entity. Although they were implemented during Devaney, they kind of gained more notoriety during this time because of that speedy offense or speedy defense, that they were able to like shut down teams, and just their aggressiveness on defense really let the black shirts, like they became their own personality. And I think it's kind of funny. I went back and looked at the origins of the black shirt name, and it kind of came about almost out of luck. Bob Devaney needed jerseys on the practice field to kind of contrast from the offensive players, and so he went to a sporting store and asked like what clothes they had. They had like green and orange and red and stuff like that. Obviously the offense was going to be wearing red and white, so he needed something to contrast with that, and the guy said, well, I got a bunch of like jerseys in the back that I can't get rid of, so he would be willing to give them to him, you know, like on sale or whatever, and they would happen to be black jerseys. And Devaney thought like, oh, this, you know, this will work perfectly, that contrasts well with white and red. So he gave these jerseys out to the defense, and the guys that were wearing those black jerseys just happened to be the ones that were going the hardest in practice. And like, so they would say like, oh, the black shirts are like really aggressive this practice, whatever. And it just kind of became an entity of its own, and it became a rite of passage almost to earn a black shirt. And that still carries through to this day. Like, you listen to Garrett Nelson still talk about it. Like, wearing a black shirt is an emotional thing because you know the history and the tradition of guys that came before you and how much blood, sweat, and tears goes into that. And that's just something, I mean, that's still something that's relevant today, and it's something that really kicked up in the 90s as well. So you had the Unity Council also installed in the locker room during this time. Tom Osborne always kind of said that he wanted the players to kind of, you know, sheriff themselves. He wanted them to be accountable to each other, not just to the coach. And so accountability was dealt on a player-by-player basis with this council. People would go to the, you know, the seniors or the captains on the team and kind of voice concerns, and it would never reach the coach. Like, if there was problems, the players would deal with it before it ever reached Tom Osborne. And that's kind of the way I think it should be, and I think that's even what Scott Frost is trying to do in like modern times, but we'll get to that in the next episode. But 93, we also switched to a faster 4-3 defensive scheme with Charlie McBride still at the helm. So Charlie McBride was the defensive coordinator from 1977 on till 1999, I think, but he was typically, I mean, we were running a different defensive scheme, and we were struggling against pass offenses. And so we switched to this 4-3. It allowed the Huskers to be a little more fluid with their pass defense, but it still allowed them to be a solid rush defense team as well. So if you can get speedy guys on that back, the linebackers and those cornerback positions, you can get really big guys on that defensive line, and they're quick as well. So you're still going to have the best of both worlds. I still think maybe Nebraska could go back to this 4-3, and I'd be happy with it. Currently, we're running a 3-4, and in the Big Ten, I just feel like it's not always working well for us. But I trust Shenander. We'll talk about that in the next episode. But 94 also introduced a big tradition in the tunnel walk. So it was revamped with the new Husker Vision screens in the stadium, and everybody knows that, you know, that initial like, you know, the intro music for that tunnel walk, and it's just something known across college football as one of the better traditions, and you know, it introduces the team, it introduces like a pumped up sensation in the stadium, and if you're ever there when that music started to kick off, like your heart starts pumping with it. So I still prefer this version over the modern stuff, but that's maybe just more nostalgia than anything. Also in 94, there's a lot of things that happened in 94, but 94, the day-by-day prayer was also introduced pregame. Somebody said a former player kind of came in to motivate the team during the 94 season, and this day-by-day prayer, you know, day by day, we get better and better. It's still something that they do now. So most players insist that this was almost more of a key motivating factor to success on the season than the tunnel walk was, or than any other thing in particular. This thing brought all the guys together before the game, got them focused, got them pumped up, and got them unified before they went out on that field. And so I think that's pretty cool as well. Like, even if you're not a religious person, to have all the guys singularly focused on one, thing, one topic, one, goal, that's something that you can't take for granted. The pipeline was also obviously established during this time as well. Nebraska's offensive line was so notorious for being aggressive, for being able to push off the ball. I mean, just for being great overall, that they earned that nickname, the pipeline. And that's something we want to get back to, since that time. All of this set up the greatest decade in Nebraska football history. Looking at 92. So as part of Tom Osborne's push to get Florida players and kind of get that speed kicked in, he persuaded Tommy Frazier to come to Nebraska. He was the third ranked overall college recruit in the 92 class, and Osborne reportedly wept when he heard that Tommy Frazier had committed to Nebraska. He did start midseason, becoming the first Husker quarterback to start as a freshman. And in 93, Nebraska would bring him back as the starter for the whole season, and he would lead to an undefeated regular season in 1993. They would face Florida State in a rematch at the Orange Bowl, and some controversy at the end of the game handed Florida State the win, 18-16. We had a goal line issue that we thought should have been a missed call, or it was a missed call, and then we missed a field goal that would have won the game for us. But Osborne was so upset by that 18-16 score that he kept that on the scoreboard at Memorial Stadium all offseason. So every time these guys went out to practice, every time these guys went out to do any kind of drill or anything, they would look up and see that score from the previous season, and it would just kind of, it would hurt you in a way that you didn't want that to happen again. And so in 1994, they came out, all guns blazing, and they would start out to have a really good season. Blood clots would sideline Tommy Frazier for the second half of the season, and many feared that, this gung-ho mentality and all this motivation that had built up this offseason was going to be lost because he was out. However, Brooke Behringer would come in, and he would take off just fine. He would be successful in his games, but he also went out with injuries. He dealt with a partially collapsed lung in one of his games, and then he wasn't medically cleared to come back the next game. So Wahoo walk-on Matt Turman filled in for him. He was like 5'10", was a very small man, but he also managed to pull out a win. So you have to look at these guys. That's your third string walk-on quarterback coming in, and he was able to push forward and help the team succeed. That just shows you how much of a team effort Nebraska was pushing at the time and how much the guys relied on each other, and that's something impressive in itself. Between the three of them, though, Nebraska would remain undefeated in the 94 season. They would show, again, the entire team's toughness and grit and the ability to push past adversity. And they capped it off with a payback Orange Bowl victory over Miami, 24-17. This would capture Tom Osborne's first national title, and it would be the first national championship for the Cone Huskers since the 1971 season, 22 seasons ago. In 1995, this was set up to be a dream year. You have all these guys coming back. Frazier's senior year, he's established himself already as a legendary college quarterback, and the roster was packed full of talent. Unfortunately, during the season, you would have controversy surrounding Heisman candidate Lawrence Phillips, and this would kind of affect the whole team. He pled not guilty to assault weeks after winning that 94 championship, and he was investigated also for receiving a $100 lunch from a sports agent, among other incidents of, money getting handed around. And shortly before the 95 season, he broke into his ex-girlfriend's apartment building before physically assaulting her, dragging her down the stairs, things like that. It actually happened to be Scott Frost's apartment building as well. But he was actually arrested and eventually temporarily, suspended by Tom Osborne from the team. And it was that, temporary suspension that kind of gained the most criticism. So the head coach was criticized for not permanently removing him from the team, both from faculty members at the school and just fans across the nation. The perception was that he was coddling a star football player because he was a star football player, and he was essentially a convict. And so you were aiding a convict because he's good at football. And Tom Osborne came out and defended his decision by saying that abandoning Phillips at this moment might do more harm than good. He said football gave him a structured environment. It was his only consistent factor in life. More guys, he was more concerned with guys becoming great men than he was having them be good football players. And he received criticism, but the team also as a whole gained a negative label from the media, and most players, came out and vehemently, defended their coach and his character, saying that, he only wants what's best for us. Like, he'll make decisions, if we're failing a class or whatever, he'll hold us from the game regardless of how good we are because he wants us to succeed in that area. And, I mean, you have these really tough defensive linemen that you would never expect this kind of emotion from, and they say, I don't know where I'd be without Tom Osborne's guidance. And so, I mean, that really goes to speak to his character. I truly believe that he did. People say that he brought Lawrence Phillips back in late in the season to help him win a national championship. If that was the case, he would have brought him in for other games where we were struggling. I mean, we never really struggled, but he would have brought him in earlier games where they were critical games, and he didn't because he wanted to make a point. But if you send Phillips, just out into the wild, he doesn't have this consistency of being in a structured program, and he could just fall off completely. So Osborne thought that he could, at least keep him on a leash in some regards and kind of keep him in check. And for the most part, he was. So after this, he was, pretty, reined in and pulled in, Phillips was, and until he left for the NFL, in which case he did completely fall off. So maybe that goes to prove the point that Tom Osborne was correct here. But almost in an effort to defend the coach's honor and to defend their own honor, and saying that, we're not criminals, like that's not who we are. We are, Nebraska football players. And they went on to play one of the best seasons in college football history. No team came within 14 points of beating them. No sacks were given up by an offensive lineman. I believe there was a stat saying like they were only trailing or tied for like 3 minutes the entire season. But they went on to outscore opponents 638 to 174. That is an astounding number. They played number 2 Florida in the Fiesta Bowl for the title, and they absolutely demolished them. The team that is supposed to be the closest to you in regards to competition, you demolished them 62 to 24. They put up over 200 yards in the second quarter alone, and they went on to make a record at the time, 524 rushing yards in that bowl game. The run from Tommy Frazier, that historic run where he breaks a ton of tackles and it seems like he drags the whole team with him to the touchdown. He seemed to embody the team's frustration with the season and the labels that had been put on them. He just like broke through 7 dudes and went off on a 75-yard touchdown run. And that's something you're not going to forget as a Nebraska fan. And I wasn't even like conscious. I mean, I was alive, but I wasn't conscious. You still see this on every highlight clip. But this was one of the most dominant teams in history, many calling it the best college team in history, and Brick Behringer would be a part of that. Unfortunately, days before the NFL draft, after they captured that second title for Tom Osborne, Brick Behringer would pass away in a plane crash days before the draft, and that really hit everybody pretty hard. Again, those players that had been so close to him in the past seasons, they talked about how you lose a brother in that instance. And there's actually a statue out in front of Memorial Stadium with Tom Osborne and Brick Behringer in front of there. Looking at the 96 season, the Big 8 merged with the Southwest Conference to create the Big 12 Conference. After getting shut out and upset by Arizona State in Week 2, Nebraska would go on a 10-game winning streak. They would make the newly formed Big 12 championship game in that very first year, and then they would go on to get upset by Texas, missing out on that national championship opportunity. They were trying to make it 3 in a row. They weren't able to do so, but they still made that first championship game in 1996 for the Big 12. 1997 would roll around, and Nebraska was once again in position to have a good season. They would be in a foot race with Michigan for the entire season for the national championship. Both teams would end the season undefeated, but there was a comeback victory in overtime in Week 9 against Missouri that would drop Nebraska to number 3 in many polls, and so that kind of put us in a we have to catch Michigan scenario. In that game against Missouri, Matt Davison would have the catch in the end zone where it kind of bounced off the foot of the intended receiver, and he came down with it in the end zone. And Michigan itself would win its bowl game that year, kind of assuring that it would win a national championship. And the AP poll, for sure, it was going to go to Michigan. There was no way that Nebraska was going to catch that. Whether or not the Huskers could close the gap on that coach's poll was in question in itself. Most players felt disheartened. Scott Frost mentioned it in an interview that, even if we win this game, we still might lose out on a national championship, even though we're undefeated. And that left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. But it was suddenly overshadowed when Tom Osborne came out before the game in December and announced that after the Orange Bowl, he would be stepping away as the head coach after 25 seasons. He said that he had made a commitment 5 years prior, saying that this would be his last season, and he kind of rallied the players behind that and said that there is a small window of opportunity. The door is open, even if it's just a little bit, but you have an opportunity here, and the players would not miss out on that opportunity for their coach. They crushed Peyton Manning's Tennessee Vols 42-17 in that year's bowl game, and that boosted them to number 1 in the coaches poll, capturing a share of that 1997 title. Tom Osborne would be the first coach to walk away after winning a national title, and that says something about his character as well, that it wasn't about the money, it wasn't about fame or ego or legacy. He wanted to be known for more than football, and he certainly did that. Tom Osborne would coach the Huskers for 25 seasons. Through 307 games, his teams would be ranked in all but 3 of them, coming away with an astounding 255 wins, 13 conference championships, and 3 national titles, never missing a bowl game in any of his seasons. In his final 5 seasons, Nebraska would go a total of 60-3. This is pretty incredible considering where we are at today. For perspective, the 2022 season will be the 25th year since Tom Osborne has retired as head coach. Even if Scott Frost somehow manages to lead Nebraska to an undefeated national title run, Osborne would still have 11 more conference championships, 2 more national titles, and 60 more wins than the 5 coaches combined in his 25 years since his departure. His dominance on the field cements him as one of the greatest college football coaches in history. However, his teams were just as successful outside of the stadium. Tom truly valued elevating his guys in his locker room. In his eyes, you should be a great man and a great human before you are a great player. Part of that was gaining an education. He took that really seriously. He produced more academic All-Americans than any other program in the nation, and it wasn't even close. In his 25 years, Nebraska totaled 65 academic All-Americans on the football team. That's more than any other school has produced in its entire history. Osborne's achievement as a college coach was so outstanding that the National Football Foundation waived its 3-year waiting period and elected him the very next year into the Hall of Fame. Similar to his predecessor, Tom Osborne would name his successor on his way out, a member of the Husker family and a longtime assistant coach, Frank Solich. But we'll cover that in next week's episode of part 4 of this Husker History series. I fully intended to try to wrap this up in 3, but obviously, there's a ton to go through for Tom Osborne, and his tenure as head coach was so incredible and, again, so long that it deserved its own episode. But what do you guys think? Did you enjoy the series so far? Do you think that Tom Osborne is the greatest collegiate coach of all time? And, what do you think about the instances in which he handled, Lawrence Phillips and the other little things that he has handled throughout his career? Let me know what you guys think down below, or you can find me on any of the social medias at Cobsmacked Media. But until next time, go Big Red.